Alright, so it's been a couple of years since I've done the wheel bearings on the trailer. And I know some of you are probably screaming in your head right now, a couple of years. Well, the trailer hadn't moved in a couple of years either. So it's time for me to get in here and check out the wheel bearings and see what I got. And I've done a lot of wheel bearings over the years. I was an Air Force aerospace ground equipment technician, and every time you did an inspection on a piece of equipment, you pretty much had to pull the wheel bearings. You had to at least check the wheel bearings. And a lot of times you're told to pull them apart and clean them and everything. And I learned a lot of ways to make the task simple and easy. I figured out the best ways to get the bearing caps off quickly. I learned how to inspect to see. I could pull the bearing cap off and usually tell you if the piece of if I needed to go in there further and clean the bearings or not. But I'm going to show you some of that today. So first off, how to take the bearing caps off. And I've seen guys just mar these up. They'll get channel locks. They'll get, everything under the sun on these, trying to take them off. And I knew guys who every time they pulled the bearing cap off, they had to replace it. I got pretty good at getting them off without tearing them up. And the trick is to don't grab the biggest hammer. Grab a nice wide chisel, and you're going to work your way around it. First thing you want to do is come at it from a couple different angles and pop it loose. You can already see it's starting to come off there. Okay, so I've got the bearing cap loosened all the way around. I'm going to come in and I'm not going to punch this way. I'm going to use the leverage of this. This is beveled. I'm going to work the punch till it's almost perpendicular to the cap, and watch, the cap will come off. Boom, there you go. This cap is reusable because I didn't tear it up. Now, to inspect this, you want to look at the grease in here. And grease, as it normally comes, is translucent. I've seen some that isn't translucent. I've seen some grease that's kind of opaque, and this stuff does look a little bit opaque. But when you get water contamination here, that translucence goes away completely, and the grease will start looking more like mud. This here doesn't look bad, but it doesn't look good. I may repack this bearing. You can see some of the grease is discolored black, and that's, that tells me it's gotten hot. So let me jack this up and we will get started on doing wheel bearings. Now, as far as the cotter pin goes, cotter pins are not reusable. Don't even try. But the easiest way to get them off is a pair of diagonal pliers. Bend that tab down. You can find the other tab broke off. Get that to come up a little bit. Oh, both tabs were bent up. I can see it now. The grease is covering it. So if I bend that tab, all you gotta do is get it up high enough to get a bite on it. There we go. It's mine now. Get a bite and just work it up. And until the head breaks off. Alright. There we go. That angle there was what was hanging the whole thing up. I got it out in 4 pieces. Now we're going to go through a bunch of rags. Alright, got a rag here. and this will have sharp edges on it. So you either want to wear latex gloves or, you know, use a rag between you and what you're doing. I've got a little sock here that makes a great rag and makes it easy to clean this stuff up. You want to inspect everything as you pull it apart. Check your wheel nut here. Make sure the bottom's not mashed flat. Make sure the threads all still have good thread on them. I'll clean that out here in a minute. There's some damage in here. I don't know why. It's not. It looks like it could just be a casting flaw. This is really rough. Yeah, I think that's a casting flaw. There's just a lot of flash on the end of this. Okay, so that bearing's gonna come out pretty quick, and I don't necessarily want to drop it in dirt. That needs more cleaning. Okay, there's my outer bearing, and yeah, that grease is burnt. So this one does need doing, but I'm not seeing water contamination. Water will turn this grease very light colored, and it'll rust up your bearings and stuff inside. I'd rather have dirt, burnt grease than water contaminated grease. Okay, and there will always be burrs inside here, so be careful when cleaning this. Alright, so I got most of the grease out of the outside there. Some guys don't like this next trick, and they'll tell you, oh my gosh, you can't do that. And I don't know if this will work on this one. It looks like that outer bearing may be too small. But if you thread, yeah, it's too small. But on some bearings, you can thread your nut back on and just pull the wheel off really fast, and it'll pop all the back bearing out. Oh, I think I'm getting bit by hands. Alright. But it'll pop that back bearing out with everything intact. If you can't do that, sometimes you can get lucky, but I wasn't. So I'm gonna have to use a pry bar and knock all this out. But if you put that front nut back on, and it'll pass through that bearing race, and you pull the wheel off real fast, it'll pull your seal and all your bearing stuff out, and 3/4 of the time that seal is reusable. Now that said, when I was doing this for the military, we always just put a new seal on there. We didn't want to risk it. If you're out in the boonies and you have a wheel bearing blowout and you've got to fix it ASAP and get it back together, get back down the road, that's how you preserve that seal, so that you can reuse it and get back on the road. So I'm going to go get a pry bar and pop that seal out and continue on. Alright, let's see if I'm lucky. Now it won't pass through the outside bearing, or the back bearing, but it will pass through this front race. It will. So, there's the seal. It's intact, but it's bent, so I didn't save it. So I'll have to go by Tractor Supply and get another bearing, or another seal, I mean. And it looks like the bearing stuck onto my bearing tool, or my pulling tool. So, yay team. Alright, so now I'm going to mop out the grease here. And you want to mop out all the grease. You want to get it all out, especially if it's contaminated, if it's burnt. Now, if I had looked in here and the grease was good on the front side, and I pulled off this back seal and the grease looked good back here, I would put it back together. And honestly, if I were getting a lot of use out of the trailer and I checked under the cap and the grease was good, I'd probably roll with it without even pulling the rest of this apart. Reason being, whenever you get your wheel bearings up to temperature, up to speed, all this grease turns to liquid. It may, well, not necessarily all of it all the time, but you're gonna have some flow and some grease moving around, and so any contamination is going to get spread throughout the bearing and the bearings, and you'll see the water contamination or the black grease. It'll all turn the same color. A trailer that's sitting, you want to pull it all the way apart, because you can have water contamination back here, and this water sitting back here behind the seal won't meet with this grease in the cap. You won't see that there's contamination. And so it's important, if the trailer has been sitting, to just go ahead and pull it apart. So okay, so when you're inspecting your bearings, you want to look and make sure there's no discoloration, that they don't look like they've been hot. You want to make sure that there's no brittling. You want to make sure that there's no cracks. And you want to make sure that bearing is seated all the way down. I've got all that. I've got the center cleaned out. And so it's going to be time to put some new grease in here and repack it and put it back together. Now, I wasn't thinking ahead. I didn't go get any seals, and also I didn't know what size seals were in here. I kind of have to have this seal to know. But this seal's all rusted and unreadable. So fat lot of good that does me. And I'm willing to bet the other seals are the same way. So I'm going to have to go down to the hardware, to the auto parts store, and size up. And basically, I think this is just a small trailer bearing seal. Usually there's just like 3 or 4 sizes of this stuff to deal with when you're dealing with trailers, especially small trailers like this. Okay, you can see this scoring on the underside of this bearing cap. It hadn't rubbed through. This bearing cap's still usable, but I'm going to want to punch this back down before I reuse it. That's rubbing on the center stub of the axle. So that's one of the things to look for, make sure that's not eating its way through. And I'm going to set these in solvent so they get clean. And I shall return. Alright, so I went and got a seal. Actually, I went and got 4 seals, 1 for each wheel, because I know they're all going to need it. So when it comes time to put the grease back in the bearing, you have an area there between the inner and outer bearings. And one of the things I've always done is taking a handful of grease and just slobbing it there in between. Like I said earlier, the grease will turn to liquid whenever you're running, and if your grease all runs out of your bearing, it's going to be there in between, and you're not going to have as much lubrication in the actual bearing itself, because it's going to be there in the middle. You want lubrication in your bearing, so if you put grease in the middle here, there's less room for that grease to go out of your bearing. Now, as far as packing the bearings themselves, there's a lot of people, when I was a young technician, I was very paranoid about packing bearings. I had to be, I was nervous about having air pockets in the bearing. I wanted to get all the grease in there and all the air out. And what I've learned over the years is that doesn't matter. There's good enough, and good enough really doesn't have to be that good. I've seen some very terrible bearing jobs that did all right. But best practice is to do your best to get as much out as you can. Now, if you're doing wheel bearings on a daily basis, wear gloves. This stuff does cause cancer over the years. I've got plenty of friends who are jacked up now. They're older than me. Wear your gloves, especially if you're packing bearings. There are special packing tools where you can just drop a bearing in and put a grease gun on it, and it does most of the work for you. And for the most part, I don't use those. And I left my bearings inside. I'm going to go get them out of the solvent now and show you how to pack bearings. Packing bearings is easy. You just put a glob of grease in your hand and you just run the bearings into it until it starts coming out the other side. Give me a minute, I'll get them out here and I'll show you. Alright, so how do you clean the bearings? Well, I've done it a bunch of different ways. I have a solvent tank, so when I left to get the seals, I've dropped these in the solvent tank and let them sit. When I came back, they were still packed full of grease. Well, what you do is you loop your finger through it and you shake it in the solvent tank, and that act of shaking it back and forth forces solvent back and forth through the bearing, and you'll get all the grease out. Now, the way to check and see if you've got the grease out is to hold it up to light. I can hold this up to the sunlight, and there's not a single... You want to check all these little places between the rollers, and you want to make sure, roll it around, check every side, and you should not see grease. You should be able to see sunlight through all those holes. And I did that on both bearings. I shook them until they came clean. They look clean. Right now they're basically just air drying, and then I'll put some grease in them. Alternatively, if you have a spray cleaner, if you have brake cleaner, that works. If you have PB Blaster is actually a really good cleaner. You can use those if you're stuck in the middle of nowhere and you have water. Water doesn't work real well, but you know, if you can get it to work, great. I have also in the past, if it had bad grease in it, just pack the wheel bearings with new grease, and that old grease will come out the top side as you're packing them. Wipe it away, make sure you have plenty of good grease in there, and you're done. I can tell you a story about me doing wheel bearings in a muddy, mosquito-filled swamp in the infield of Sebring International Raceway. I did all 4 wheel bearings on a trailer in the mud with just a handful of parts. I bought all the trailer bearings I could find in town. There weren't a whole lot. There weren't enough to do the trailer, but I mixed and matched parts and got it back together. Wheel bearings aren't crazy. They're not terribly hard. They don't have to be perfect. You just want to get enough lube in there that you can get home. And you can do them in field conditions. You know, I'm trying to be careful not to get grass and dirt in there, but if I do, it's not going to kill the wheel bearings. Wheel bearings are old school technology. You know, if you're dealing with an aircraft engine, oh yeah, you got to avoid all kinds. You know, you don't want any contamination. You've got to get everything perfect. But trailer wheel bearings, they are not picky. You want them to roll. So I've taught this to a bunch of young airmen. This is how you pack wheel bearings. Get you a nice good sized glob. This is not quite enough. Grease is going down too far in the tube for me to reach. But I'm going to take this wheel bearing and I'm just going to sit here and cram grease into it. You can see it starts coming out the top there. I'm going to take that grease off the top, put it right back in my palm, turn this little turn, start packing grease again. And it starts coming out the top. It's coming out the top. It's not as much as I'd like, but that's good enough for me being short on grease. Nice Camaro. The last couple of days has been testing tuning this road out behind my house. Please be respectful of your neighbors and don't do that. Track has test and tune. Alright, so you can see right there, boom, that's done. It didn't take long at all to get that thing full of grease all the way around. So I'm going to take this wheel bearing, now it's full of grease, I'm just going to set it on top of my bearing cap up here. And I'm going to start working on this other bearing. I don't know that it dried out as much as that one, but there's a little saltness on there. I think I'm okay. And that one's full of grease too. That's all it takes to pack wheel bearings. It doesn't have to be perfect, you just want a good amount of grease in here. And as I said, it's messy. Typically, and I'm only doing one wheel right here right now just to show. Typically you want to have all 4 wheels off and just do all, getting messy all at once and you clean all at once. And I'm not doing that. I'm trying to show you how to do this. So, I've got my big globs of grease here in the middle. I'm going to take this big bearing and drop it in. Okay, so this new seal, I want to get nice and flat. Now you want to check your bearing surface or your spindle surface here where that seal rides, and if it's got a groove in it where the seal is ridden, you want to set the new seal at a slightly different height. You either want to have it a little further out, a little further in, but mine's fine, so I'm going to try to get this nice and flush. Now, when I worked for the Air Force, we didn't have this tool. Don't know why, we should have. And so I just basically would tap, feel whatever side's up, and that's the side you tap on, and just tap seals on, like that. But I've got this tool. Feel which side is up and try to put your force on that side. Now it's all about to go down at the same time. And that is good and flush. You need a little more on this side. All right, so inside wheel bearings done. Take this outer wheel bearing, throw it in place. If it doesn't want to slide in place, rock your tire, and that'll get it going in. Okay, you got your washer here with the flat side. You want to make sure that your washer isn't going to spin. It'll either have a locking tab or it'll have a flat side like that. And thread the nut on. Now, how tight do you get the nut? When I first started as a technician, the old school guys would tell you tighten it all the way down, then back it off two flats, two flat sides of the nut. And I'll tell you, that is way, way too loose nowadays. I don't know how long bearings lasted like that back then in the day when they taught that originally, but that is, you're going to kill bearings doing that nowadays. And basically, you're going to tighten it up until you feel it bottom out, and then you're going to back it off until you can get a nut in there, and then you're going to check to see how wobbly it is. So, if you have a Ford wrench, they work a lot better than channel locks. I don't have a Ford wrench. I thought about buying one, just never got around to it. So, oh, that feels like it's bottoming out already. Okay, so, yeah, so that's snug. But I'm not quite lined up. So if I back off, hear that? That's too loose. So I do want to tighten it up. And that is snug. It's a little tighter than I like, but there's no wobble. So that's where I want it. When it comes to replacing the cotter pin, you don't want to go small in the cotter pin. You want the biggest cotter pin that'll fit through there. And if you get cotter pins and they're just monstrously long, guess what? Cotter pins are made to be cut down. So I'm going to go grab my cotter pin kit and we'll drop one in here, see where we're at. Alright, so this is the cotter pin kit from everybody's favorite cheap tool store. I'll tell you, that one's too big. This looks like it might be the right diameter. And the thing about cotter pins in these wheel bearings is sometimes you have to try it a little bit. Okay, that one's not wanting to fit, so I think that's a little too big. Let's go to the next size down. And that one fits. Okay, so as I said, don't worry about the cotter pin being too long. You can grab this bottom. You can grab the outside edge of the cotter pin. And basically you're going to fold it back up over the top. And tap it flat with your hammer. That way it doesn't eat on the inside of your bearing cap. Now this bottom, you can see, is going to overhang. Now I did see a tip a long time ago where, supposedly Rolls-Royce guys, technicians, would take and twist the head so that they could drop it in and these could curl up around the outside. Don't bother. Get your safety goggles on and grab your cutting dikes, diagonal cutters. Cut off that tail. Take your hammer and your chisel. Tuck it up. for your bearing cap. I saw guys year after year, the guys I worked with would put caps on dry. And remember what I said about the grease turning to a liquid whenever you get the wheel bearings nice and hot? You want to have some grease in here. So let me straighten this cap out real quick. There we go, give it a nice bowl shape again. I'll get a scoop of grease here. Now you don't want to pack the cap full, because if you put too much grease in your wheel bearing, it will push the cap off. But that right there is a nice amount of grease to put inside your grease cap. When you tap this back on, tap on the outside edge. Don't hit the middle or you'll cave it in. There's a lip curled up right there. I think that'll work. That'll be good till next year. And if I don't drive it, it'll be good for a few years, right? So anyways, there's wheel bearings, quick and easy way. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other three, and if I come across any water contamination, I'll see if I can get that on film. All right, I got the wheel bearings done on all four hubs. Real quick, you may have spotted it. Whenever I put that first wheel back on, I didn't lube the seal as I was putting the hub on there. You want to do that. You want to put a little bit of grease on that seal that's riding on that surface so you don't burn it up in the first few miles. Secondly, this grease I have is old, but I use this trailer 3-4 times a year. If you're putting together a jet engine, yeah, use the top name grease, you know, what's spec'd. Make sure that the shelf life is still within. This stuff is, you know, it's years and years old, but how many times you watch these videos where these guys go drag cars out of the field and put some gas and other stuff in them and fire them up and get them on the road? They're not going and repacking all the wheel bearings unless they have to take the brakes apart. Grease, for the most part, is grease. Don't overthink it. If I were towing 1,000,000 miles a year with this trailer, by all means, I would go in and I would put, you know, top name grease, fresh grease. But I use this trailer 3 times a year, 4 times a year. So don't overthink the grease part of it. And finally, you know, I mentioned that if you're doing a bunch of wheel bearings, you want to pull them all out and do them all at once to save time and effort. Be careful not to mix up your wheel bearings. I made sure I did each of those wheels over there one at a time, but when I did these 2 wheels, I made sure that I took the bearings out and set the front bearings towards the front and the back bearings towards the back, and whenever I washed them, I kept them separate and I put them back in the hubs they came from. You can't mix used races and used bearings. You can mix new bearings with old races or old bearings with new races, but once the bearings are worn in and they're used, you cannot mix used bearings, if that makes sense. So be mindful of that. And that's the easy way. There's no real easy way to do bearings other than buy a pre-packed hub and throw it on there. That's expensive. This here, I spent $18 on seals. I had an old tube of grease, and I just pulled the bearings out, cleaned them up. If you buy all new hubs and do it the easy way, you're spending a couple $100. This is not rocket science. I showed you how to preserve the cap. If you've got a cap that's dinged up though and bent, by all means, if the lip is not round, you want to replace that cap. Or if it's rusted through, or if that cotter pin is stuck out and worn a groove on here, on the inside, worn it through, replace that cap. That'll add a couple dollars onto your job. But there we go. I got the wheel bearings done. I may have to replace tire here. This tire is looking kind of ratty. And then tomorrow I've got to get in here and rewire this thing from scratch. The wiring's been torn up for a while, and I patched it up enough to get it around. I've got a set of stick-on lights I'll use the last few times, the magnetic lights, but I really just need to start over from scratch on the wiring on this thing and get it done. You know, that's one thing I really know how to do is wiring, and what haven't I done on this trailer? Rewired it. More to follow. Also, I shot a little bit of PB blaster on each of these, on each wheel's threads. You know, that's not a bad idea when you're doing wheel bearing maintenance. The last thing you want to do is you know, have a blow up by the side of the road and go to pull a wheel off and you haven't had the lug nut off in 10 years and it's rusted in place. So whenever you do wheel bearings, zip those lug nuts on and off, and put some PP blaster on there, zip them off, zip them back on, and get the, you know, just get them lubed up, and that'll give you less headaches on the road.